Rule number 1 of the sky: keep your polite smile locked in place and never mock an alpha's pride. I broke both rules. I took one look at his luxurious private jet and laughed in his face. I expected him to yell. I expected him to demand my badge. Instead, the heavy cabin doors slammed shut, the locks clicked, and the dangerous man sitting across the aisle informed me we were taking a one-way detour to a private jungle island. He thinks isolating me will shatter my defenses. He believes the wild mate bond burning between us will force my submission. He thinks he holds all the power. He is wrong. I survive turbulence and entitled men for a living. I refuse to bow. But before the jet doors locked and the island standoff began, it all started with a simple complaint in row 2. Chapter 1. Cynthia pushed the narrow metal beverage cart down the aisle. The flight to the coastal city always dragged. Most passengers slept, their heads tilted against the plastic windows. She stopped at row 2 and pulled a clear trash bag from the bottom shelf. The man in the window seat took up too much room. Broad shoulders stretched the fabric of his dark gray shirt. He stared straight ahead, a deep frown lines etched around his mouth. Then, the scent hit her. It washed over the stale cabin air like a shockwave, toasted almonds and fresh pine needles. Cynthia dropped the roll of trash bags. Her inner wolf ripped its eyes open. The beast slammed against the inside of her ribs. "Mate!" her wolf shrieked. "Bite his neck! Tear his clothes! Claim him in the aisle!" Cynthia squeezed her eyes shut. She forced the feral monster down into a mental cage. She took a slow breath. She wore a tailored navy blue uniform, and she had a job to do. She did not act like a wild animal in public. She picked up the bags, pasted on her standard polite smile, and turned to the man. He shifted his weight. His knees bumped the seat in front of him. He let out a harsh, frustrated breath and rubbed the back of his neck. 2 more hours until I reach my aircraft, Richard muttered. He spoke to no one in particular, but his deep voice carried. This tight box is pure torture. If my mechanic did his job, I would stretch out on a custom sofa right now. Cynthia kept her spine straight. She held out the open trash bag. "We apologize for the legroom, sir," Cynthia said. Her voice stayed crisp and level. "But on the bright side, this commercial plane passes a strict federal safety check every single week. I doubt your private ride does the same." Richard stopped rubbing his neck. He turned his head and locked eyes with her. His inner wolf, which had been pacing in a foul mood all morning, suddenly stopped. The beast sniffed the air. "Mate!" his wolf barked, tail thumping so hard Richard felt the phantom impact in his spine. "She is here! Give her a shiny rock! Fetch a stick!" Richard shoved the ridiculous animal to the back of his mind. He kept his face calm and serious. Most people scrambled to apologize when he complained. This woman just stood her ground and handed him facts. He leaned forward. He gave her his complete attention. "My aircraft is a masterpiece," Richard said. He did not raise his voice. "It is built for luxury. No cramped knees." Cynthia balanced the trash bag on her hip. She did not flinch under his intense stare. "I am sure it looks expensive," Cynthia replied smoothly. "But owners love putting heavy stone tables and loose wet bars in those custom cabins. It looks great until you hit rough air, then it becomes a flying hazard." Richard felt a sharp spike of interest. She possessed a firm grasp on her facts. She spoke with clear authority, completely unfazed by his size or his dominant tone. "You think my plane is a flying hazard?" Richard stated. "I think wealthy men choose style over survival," Cynthia answered. "Can I get you another water, sir?" Snarl at the other passengers. Her wolf scratched at her mind. Mark him. Drag him to the back row. Cynthia ignored the beast. She kept her polite smile locked in place. Richard let out a short, rough laugh. He respected her nerve. He liked a woman with a spine. "My jet is parked at the private hangar we land at," Richard said. "I want you to walk on board and tell me that to my face." Cynthia offered a crisp nod. "My shift ends the second we land. I will gladly give you a free safety inspection." She moved to the next row, leaving him behind. Richard watched her walk away. His wolf spun in dizzy circles, demanding he follow her and offer her snacks. Richard stayed put. He folded his arms across his chest and waited for the plane to land. He had a new plan. The pack border dispute could wait. He needed to show this woman exactly who held the power. Chapter 2. The commercial flight touched down an hour later. Cynthia finished her landing duties, handed her paperwork to the gate agent, and walked to the crew closet. She grabbed her navy blue overnight duffel bag. It felt a little lighter than usual, but she ignored it. She slung the strap over her shoulder and walked out into the terminal. Richard waited near the glass doors of the private hangar entrance. He stood tall, hands in his pockets. When Cynthia approached, he offered a single nod and pushed the double doors open. They walked out onto the sunlit tarmac. A sleek white jet sat parked near the edge of the runway. A man in a pilot uniform stood near the boarding stairs. This was Gideon, Richard's beta. Gideon took one breath as Cynthia approached. His eyes widened. He looked at Richard, then at Cynthia, and a slow smirk spread across his face. He understood the situation immediately. "Welcome aboard," Gideon said, stepping aside. Cynthia climbed the stairs. She stepped into the cabin. Richard followed right behind her. He waited for her jaw to drop. He expected her to look around the space and realize the true extent of his wealth. Instead, a laugh bubbled in her throat. She pressed a hand to her mouth, but the amused sound slipped out anyway. Richard frowned. "You find my aircraft funny?" Cynthia turned around. She kept her posture flawless. "It is a beautiful plane, sir," Cynthia said, "but whoever designed the interior has never hit a pocket of turbulence." Richard tilted his head. "Explain." "Those burgundy velvet seats," Cynthia pointed to the plush chairs. "They will trap every drop of spilled wine. They are impossible to clean fast. And that heavy gold-plated bar cart?" She walked over and tapped the shiny metal cart sitting near the leather sofa. "This is a flying nightmare," Cynthia said. "One bad storm and that cart turns into a wrecking ball. It is all style and zero safety." Most women fawned over his money. Cynthia just gave him a health and safety citation. Richard did not snap or puff out his chest. He absorbed her words. "Buy her a safer cart," his wolf yipped happily. "Wrap her in a blanket." Richard ignored the wolf. He closed the distance between them. "A hazard," Richard repeated. "Good thing I thrive on danger." Cynthia held his gaze. Her inner wolf wanted to tackle him onto the velvet seats and sink her teeth into his collarbone. Cynthia forced her breathing to stay even. She refused to let the animal win. "You should bolt it down," Cynthia advised, patting the gold cart one last time. "Now, I gave you your inspection. I need to catch a cab to my hotel." She turned toward the exit. Gideon stood in the doorway. He grabbed the heavy cabin door and pulled it shut with a loud metallic slam. The locks clicked into place. Chapter 3. The locking mechanism echoed through the quiet cabin. Cynthia stopped walking. She stared at the closed door. The jet engines roared to life, sending a low vibration through the floorboards. "He trapped us," her wolf snarled, but the beast did not sound angry. It sounded thrilled. "Submit! Roll over! Let him win!" Cynthia pushed the pathetic animal aside. She turned around to face Richard. She smoothed her uniform skirt and kept her chin level. She did not scream. She did not panic. "The door just locked," Cynthia stated. "It did," Richard agreed. He gestured to one of the velvet seats. "Take a seat, Cynthia. We are skipping my pack meeting." Cynthia did not move toward the chair. She crossed her arms. "Kidnapping a flight crew member carries a severe federal fine," Cynthia said. Her voice remained steady. "You are making a poor choice. Tell your pilot to open that door." Richard liked her composure. A weaker woman would cry or throw a tantrum. Cynthia handled his stunt like a poorly planned corporate event. "My pilot takes orders from me," Richard said. He walked over to the custom sofa and sat down, making himself comfortable. "We are taking a detour." Where exactly are we going? Cynthia asked. A private island, Richard answered. Let's see how well you handle turbulence. Cynthia let out a sharp sigh. She walked over to the burgundy velvet seat and sat down. She buckled the safety belt across her waist with a loud snap. You have terrible communication skills, Cynthia told him. If you wanted to spend time together, you could just ask for my phone number. Richard let out a low, genuine laugh. I prefer guaranteed results. The jet rolled down the runway and lifted into the sky. Cynthia looked out the window as the ground dropped away. She felt the mate pull tugging at her chest. It drew her toward the man sitting across the aisle. She knew what he was. Only an alpha pulled a stunt this arrogant. Go sit on his lap, her wolf demanded. Cynthia gripped the armrests. She refused to lose her professional edge. She spent her life dealing with rich, entitled men. She would not let this alpha break her rules. You owe me overtime pay for this flight, Cynthia said, staring him down. Richard smiled. It was a calm, confident expression. He listened to her demands and found them fascinating. He prioritized her safety, but he refused to let her leave until she accepted the bond between them. I will cover all your expenses, Richard promised. Enjoy the ride. Chapter 4. The flight lasted 3 hours. Cynthia spent the entire time ignoring the alpha. She reviewed a safety manual she found in the seat pocket just to prove she did not care about his presence. Richard watched her. His inner wolf spent the flight pacing and whining, begging him to offer her a drink or a pillow. Richard kept his mouth shut. He wanted to see how long she could keep up the unbothered act. The jet began its descent. Cynthia looked out the window. There was no concrete runway. There were no terminal buildings. She saw nothing but a massive stretch of dense green jungle and a narrow dirt landing strip carved through the trees. The plane hit the dirt with a rough bounce. The heavy gold-plated bar cart rattled loudly in its corner, proving her earlier point. Cynthia unbuckled her belt before the plane even came to a complete stop. She grabbed her navy blue duffel bag from the floor. Gideon opened the cabin door and lowered the stairs. Warm, humid air flooded into the plane. Cynthia walked down the stairs. Her low heels crunched against the dirt. The jungle surrounded them. Tall palm trees and thick vines created a wall of green. Hunt, her inner wolf urged, loving the wild environment. Run into the trees. Cynthia tightened her grip on her bag. She refused to show fear. She turned to Richard as he walked down the stairs. A dirt runway, Cynthia said. Your landing gear needs a full wash after this. Where is the hotel? No hotel, Richard said. He pointed down a narrow gravel path leading into the trees. Just a cabin. Follow me. He walked past her, taking the lead. He wanted to show his protective nature. He kept his senses sharp, scanning the tree line for any threats. Cynthia followed him. She adjusted the strap of her bag. I hope you brought groceries, Cynthia told his broad back, because I do not forage for berries. The pantry is fully stocked, Richard replied without looking back. You will not starve. Give her the food now, his wolf barked. She might be hungry. Feed the mate. Richard ignored the loud voice in his head. He led her down the winding path. The air felt heavy with heat. They reached a clearing. A large wooden cabin sat in the middle of the space. It looked sturdy and isolated. Home for the next few days, Richard announced. He walked up the wooden steps to the front porch. Cynthia followed him up the steps. She looked at the heavy oak front door. It looked old. She wondered if the inside matched the terrible velvet decor of his jet. Richard reached out and grabbed the brass door handle. He pulled it open. A loud snap echoed across the porch. The top metal hinge broke clean in half. The heavy oak door tilted sideways and slammed against the wooden frame, completely stuck. Cynthia stopped walking. She looked at the broken door, then looked up at the big, powerful alpha. Looks like your maintenance team failed again, Cynthia said. Richard stared at the broken wood. His perfect kidnapping plan just hit a wall. He let out a slow, steady breath. Chapter 5. Cynthia stared at the heavy oak front door. It hung at a crooked angle, groaning against the bottom hinge. The top brass plate had sheared completely in half, leaving the thick slab of wood jammed against the doorframe. "Looks like your maintenance team failed again," Cynthia said, shifting her navy blue duffel bag higher on her shoulder. Richard let out a long breath. He didn't yell. He didn't kick the broken wood. Instead, he shrugged off his tailored gray suit jacket. He draped the expensive fabric over the porch railing. He rolled up the sleeves of his dark dress shirt, revealing thick, corded forearms. "Look at those arms!" her inner wolf howled, scratching at the back of her mind. "Bite him! Jump on his back!" Cynthia forced a bland smile, trapping the wild beast inside her mental cage. "Do we sleep on the porch, or do you have a plan?" "I'll fix it," Richard answered. He stepped past her and walked to a weather-beaten wooden storage bench resting at the far end of the porch. He popped the lid. The sharp clatter of metal rang out as he pulled a heavy red steel toolbox from the depths. He carried it back to the door and set it by his boots. Cynthia watched him pop the latches. She expected him to call a crew. Billionaires didn't do manual labor. They threw money at problems. But Richard dug through the compartments, pulling out a steel screwdriver and a spare brass hinge. "You know how to use those?" Cynthia asked, raising an eyebrow. Richard shot her a look. "I manage an entire pack. I can handle a few screws." He wedged his shoulder under the heavy oak door, lifting it to take the weight off the bottom hinge. His muscles flexed tight under his shirt. Sweat beaded at his temples. He unscrewed the broken metal pieces with steady, practiced turns. "He provides." Richard's wolf barked, puffing out its chest. "Show her our strength! Build her a den!" Richard ignored the lunatic dog in his head. He lined up the new brass hinge. "Hold this edge right here," he instructed, nodding to the center of the door. Cynthia dropped her bag and stepped closer. She placed her hands flat against the rough wood, steadying the heavy slab. The heat rolling off his body hit her like a punch to the gut. He stood mere inches away, his jaw tight with focus. He drove the steel screws into the wood with ease. "For a man with a private jet, you make a decent carpenter," Cynthia noted. She kept her tone crisp, ignoring the sudden spike in her pulse. "I built my first house from the ground up," Richard said, driving the final screw home. He stepped back and wiped a smear of grease from his thumb. "Try it." Cynthia pushed the door. It swung open, silent and smooth. "Passes inspection," she declared. Richard picked up his toolbox and jacket. He gestured for her to enter the cabin. "Welcome to the island." Cynthia grabbed her bag and walked inside. The interior held an open floor plan. A large, gray, sectional sofa dominated the living room. A kitchen with dark granite counters sat to the right. A single hallway led to the back of the house. No velvet, no gold trim, just sturdy furniture and clean lines. "It needs a good dusting," Cynthia commented, running a finger along the kitchen counter. Richard closed the heavy oak door behind them. The lock clicked. The island standoff had officially begun. "The groundskeeper comes once a week to restock the pantry," Richard said, setting the red toolbox on the floor. "He leaves the cleaning to me." "And you brought me here to be your maid?" Cynthia asked, her voice dropping into her customer service tone. "Because my hourly rate for housekeeping is luxurious." Richard let out a rumble of a laugh. "You aren't here to clean. You're here because you laughed at my ship and my pilot locked the doors." "Your beta locked the doors," Cynthia corrected. "I know how pack dynamics work. Don't play dumb." Richard paused, tossing his jacket onto the gray sofa. He gave her a sharp look. "You caught that." "I caught the way he looked at you," Cynthia said. She walked toward the kitchen, putting distance between them. "I know an alpha when I see one. The arrogance gives it away." "He is our alpha," her inner wolf yelped. "Drop to the floor. Show your neck." Cynthia gritted her teeth. She wanted to muzzle her own soul. "If you know what I am," Richard said, his voice dropping an octave, "then you know why we're here." "We're here because you threw a tantrum," Cynthia replied smoothly. She set her bag on a bar stool. "Now, where's the bathroom? I need to change out of this uniform before I write you a formal complaint." Richard pointed down the short hallway. "First door on the left." Cynthia nodded once. "Don't break anything else while I'm gone." She grabbed her duffel and marched down the hall. Richard watched her go. "Follow her," his wolf whined. "Bring her a towel." Richard dragged a hand down his face. This was going to be a very long trip. Welcome back to Lina's Romantasy collection, where the alphas think they rule the world, but our heroines run the show. Quick question for the pack before we take off today. What is the one snack you always pack for a trip? Let me know in the comments and drop an airplane emoji if you are listening to this while you are supposed to be working. Today, we have a great one. It is funny, it is heated, and it involves a billionaire alpha throwing a kidnapping stunt and a flight attendant who just laughs in his face. But before we board, if you want to support the channel and get early access to stories like this, hit that join button down below. It helps keep the channel running and the fresh stories flowing. Now buckle your seatbelts, the cabin doors are locked, and the alpha is about to learn a very tough lesson. Let's dive in. Chapter 6. Cynthia locked the bathroom door. She leaned against the cool wood and let out a frustrated breath. The wild animal inside her chest paced in tight, agitated circles. It hated being locked away from the mate. "Quiet," Cynthia muttered to herself. She turned to the sink, splashed cold water on her face, and patted her skin dry with a clean white hand towel she found on the rack. She set her navy blue overnight bag on the closed toilet lid. She reached for the zipper, eager to shed the stiff polyester of her airline uniform. She needed her comfortable black leggings and her oversized gray sweater. She needed armor. She yanked the zipper open. Cynthia froze. She stared into the bag. A bright, neon pink fabric glared back at her. "No," Cynthia whispered. She plunged her hands into the bag and pulled out a rolled-up t-shirt. The words "Beach Boss" were printed across the front in glittering turquoise letters. Beneath the shirt sat a pair of bright yellow rubber flip-flops, a floral sarong, and a bottle of coconut tanning oil. The airline ground crew. They swapped her bag with a tourist flying coach. "We can't wear this," her inner wolf snarled in horror. "We look like a clown. Our mate will reject us." "Shut up," Cynthia hissed. She dug deeper, praying for a stray pair of sweatpants. Nothing. Just the neon shirt, some denim cut-off shorts that looked 3 sizes too small, and the flip-flops. She looked at her uniform. It smelled like airplane coffee and stress. She refused to wear it a second longer. She had no choice. 10 minutes later, Cynthia yanked the bathroom door open. She marched down the hallway. The neon pink t-shirt hung past her hips. The bright yellow flip-flops slapped against the hardwood floor with an obnoxious smack, smack, smack sound. Richard stood in the kitchen. He had opened the refrigerator and inspected the contents. He heard the slapping footsteps and turned around. He stopped dead. Cynthia shifted her weight to one hip, standing directly under the kitchen pendant lights. The turquoise Beach Boss lettering sparkled. Richard stared at her. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He pressed his lips together, fighting a losing battle. "Not a word," Cynthia warned, pointing a rigid finger at him. A rough, booming laugh burst from Richard's chest. It bounced off the cabin walls. He leaned against the granite counter, chuckling so hard his shoulders shook. "She is a vision," his wolf yapped, tail wagging frantically. "The brightest flower in the jungle. Fetch her a coconut." "The ground crew swapped my bag," Cynthia explained, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "This belongs to a woman named Brenda who is probably very upset right now." Richard wiped a tear of mirth from his eye. "I like it. It asserts dominance. You truly are the boss of the beach." Cynthia narrowed her eyes. "If you make one more joke, I'll file a union grievance." Richard held up both hands in mock surrender. He pushed away from the counter, a persistent grin stuck on his face. "I apologize. I didn't mean to disrespect your authority, boss." "I hate you," Cynthia stated. She slapped her way over to the kitchen island and hopped onto a tall wooden stool. The flip-flops dangled from her feet. Despite the ridiculous outfit, she kept her posture straight and her chin high. She refused to let him win the psychological war. Richard walked to the pantry and pulled open the double doors. Inside, shelves sat neatly lined with canned goods, pasta, and fresh bread left by the groundskeeper. "Are you hungry, boss?" Richard asked over his shoulder. "Starving," Cynthia admitted, "and don't call me that." "We have steak, potatoes, and some green beans," Richard said, pulling items from the lower shelves. "Or I can make pasta." "Steak," Cynthia ordered. She leaned her elbows on the counter. "Medium rare, and I expect first-class service." Richard gathered the ingredients and carried them to the island. He set a heavy cast-iron skillet on the stove. He looked at the woman sitting in his kitchen. She wore a tourist trap t-shirt, demanded perfect service, and looked completely unafraid of him. His wolf scratched at his ribs, begging to rest its head on her lap. Richard grabbed a steel knife and started chopping potatoes, trying to ignore the sudden urge to build her a throne. "You realize you're holding me hostage," Cynthia said, watching his precise knife movements. "Making me dinner doesn't clear your criminal record." "I prefer the term mandatory vacation," Richard countered. He tossed the cubed potatoes into a glass bowl. "Besides, you needed a break. Your airline pays you to smile at rude people all day. Here, you can frown as much as you want." Cynthia let out a short huff. "I don't frown. I maintain a professional demeanor. There's a difference." "Right," Richard said, his lips twitching again as he glanced at the turquoise glitter on her chest. "Very professional." Cynthia kicked a yellow flip-flop off her foot. It hit him square in the shin. Richard just laughed again, firing up the stove burner. Chapter 7. The smell of searing meat filled the cabin. Cynthia sat on her wooden stool, watching Richard work the stove. The cast-iron skillet hissed as he flipped the thick cuts of beef with a pair of steel tongs. "Raw," her inner wolf snapped, drooling at the scent of blood and heat. "Take it from the pan! Eat it now!" Cynthia pushed the feral urge down. She crossed her legs, letting the remaining yellow flip-flop dangle. "You're searing it too fast. The heat is too high. You'll burn the outside before the center cooks." Richard glanced over his shoulder. "I've cooked my own meals for 10 years. I know how to handle a steak." "Confidence doesn't equal competence," Cynthia replied, channeling her best flight attendant voice. "I see rich men make bad decisions every day. Turn the burner down." Richard paused. He looked at the dial. He looked at Cynthia. Then, slowly, he reached out and clicked the burner down 2 notches. "Thank you for your cooperation," Cynthia said, offering a crisp nod. Richard shook his head, a quiet chuckle rumbling in his chest. He grabbed a handful of green beans and tossed them into a separate pan. "Bring her a piece," his wolf cried, pacing a trench in his mind. "Feed the mate! Let her pet our ears!" Richard clamped his jaw shut, forcing his wild side to sit down and behave. He plated the food 5 minutes later, setting a steaming white ceramic dish in front of Cynthia. He handed her a steel fork and a serrated knife. Cynthia inspected the plate. The potatoes were golden brown, the beans looked crisp, and the steak had a perfect crust. She cut into the meat. A warm pink center revealed itself. Medium rare, exactly as she ordered. "Acceptable," Cynthia announced. "I aim to please," Richard said, taking his own plate and sitting on the stool next to her. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds were the clanking of steel cutlery against ceramic and the hum of the refrigerator. Cynthia chewed her food, analyzing the man beside her. He didn't act like the alphas she read about in pack reports. He didn't shout. He didn't demand she bow her head. He just fixed doors and cooked dinner. It made him dangerous. It made him hard to hate. "So," Cynthia started, pointing her fork at him, "what's the end goal here? You dragged me to an island because I hurt your feelings. How long does the tantrum last?" Richard swallowed his bite of food. He set his fork down and turned to face her. I didn't bring you here because my feelings were hurt. Then why? Cynthia challenged. Give me one logical reason why a pack leader abandons his duties to play castaway with a flight attendant. Richard looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. She wore a ridiculous neon shirt, yet she commanded the room. Because the moment you walked onto my flight, my wolf stopped pacing, Richard said, his voice quiet but heavy with truth. And when you laughed at my jet, you didn't look at my money, you looked at me. Cynthia froze. The piece of potato on her fork slipped off and hit the plate. He knows, her inner wolf howled in victory. Claim him! Jump across the counter! Cynthia gripped the edge of the island. She refused to let the bond dictate her life. She worked too hard for her independence to just roll over for a fateful cent. I looked at a safety hazard, Cynthia corrected, her voice tight. That isn't a marriage proposal. I know, Richard said easily. He picked up his fork again. That's why we're here, to figure it out without the rest of the world watching. Cynthia glared at him. She hated how reasonable he sounded. She hated his calm demeanor. She wanted a fight, and he kept offering her dinner. I don't want to figure it out, Cynthia stated. We have plenty of time, Richard replied. He pointed at her plate. Eat your green beans, boss. Cynthia stabbed a bean with her fork, imagining it was his arrogant head. Don't think a decent meal buys my compliance, Cynthia warned, chewing with purpose. I'm still writing you up. The Federal Aviation Authority will hear about this unauthorized detour. Write the report, Richard offered, unbothered. I'll provide the pen and paper. I'll even mail it for you when we leave. Cynthia let out an exasperated noise. You're impossible. I'm thorough, Richard corrected. He stood up and gathered their empty plates, carrying them to the stainless steel sink. He turned on the faucet, washing the dishes with quick, efficient movements. Cynthia watched his back, noting the shift of muscle beneath his shirt. She needed to establish boundaries before this island stripped away her remaining defenses. We need ground rules, Cynthia announced to his back. Richard shut off the water. I'm listening. Chapter 8. Cynthia hopped off the wooden stool. The lone yellow flip-flop smacked against the floorboards as she walked into the living room. She pointed at the large gray sectional sofa. Rule number 1, Cynthia declared. I get the bedroom, you get the couch. Richard dried his hands on a kitchen towel. He walked over and stood beside her, looking at the sofa. Done. Cynthia blinked. She prepared a 5-minute argument defending her right to a mattress. Just like that? No alpha posturing about owning the property? You're my guest, Richard said simply. A good host ensures his guest is comfortable. The bedroom is yours. He provides, his wolf yipped, vibrating with joy. Give her all the pillows. Cynthia narrowed her eyes, searching for a trap. When she found none, she moved to her next point. Rule number 2, Cynthia continued, holding up 2 fingers. No uninvited entries into my room. The door stays closed. If you need something, you knock. Understood, Richard agreed. He leaned against the back of the sofa, arms crossed. Any other demands, boss? Rule number 3, Cynthia said, ignoring the nickname. Keep your wild side in check. I feel the bond just as much as you do, but I'm ignoring it. I expect you to do the same. No growling, no possessive behavior, no acting like a feral dog. Bite his chin, her inner wolf shrieked, outraged by the rules. Tackle him! Cynthia kept her face perfectly neutral, locking the beast away. Richard tilted his head. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. He heard the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned the bond. He knew she fought a war inside her own mind. I can control myself, Richard promised, his voice dropping low. Can you? The words stole the breath from her lungs. A flush of heat crept up her neck. She hated that he saw right through her professional mask. I'm a trained professional, Cynthia snapped. I handle turbulence and engine failures. I can handle you. She turned on her heel, leaving her second flip-flop near the kitchen island, and marched barefoot down the hallway. She reached the single bedroom at the end of the hall and pushed the door open. The room held a massive, king-sized bed covered in a plain white quilt. 2 wooden nightstands flanked the mattress. A large window overlooked the dark, rustling jungle outside. It looked peaceful. She stepped inside and grabbed the brass door handle. "Good night, Alpha," Cynthia called out. "Good night, Cynthia." Richard's voice drifted down the hall, deep and steady. She shut the door until it clicked. She immediately reached for the lock and twisted the metal dial. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood, letting out a shaky breath. The silence of the cabin pressed in on her. Without the noise of passengers or the hum of jet engines, her thoughts grew loud. Her inner wolf scratched endlessly at the barrier in her mind, whining for the man sleeping on the sofa. Cynthia pushed away from the door. She walked to the bed and pulled the white quilt back. She climbed onto the mattress, curling her knees to her chest. The neon pink t-shirt provided zero comfort. She missed her uniform. She missed the structured rules of the sky. Out in the living room, Richard pulled a spare gray blanket from a storage ottoman. He stretched out on the sectional sofa. It was long enough to fit his frame, but it felt empty. "Go to her," his wolf cried, pacing relentlessly. "Sleep at the foot of the bed. Guard the door." Richard shoved a throw pillow under his head. "Quiet," he muttered into the dark room. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the jungle. He heard the wind rustle the palm fronds outside. More importantly, his sharp hearing picked up the steady rhythm of Cynthia's heartbeat down the hall. She acted tough. She built walls made of aviation rules and sass. But he knew the truth. The mate bond pulled at them both, weaving an invisible thread through the cabin walls. She could lock the door, but she couldn't lock out nature. Richard closed his eyes. He had no intention of rushing her. A smart alpha knew when to push and when to wait. He would give her the space she demanded. He would let the isolation of the island work its magic. He drifted off to sleep, the tropical heat lingering in the cabin air. The standoff was in full effect, and Richard planned to win. Chapter 9. Morning sunlight pierced the bedroom window, casting bright lines across the broad, king-sized bed. Cynthia kicked off the plain white quilt. The neon pink fabric of her tourist shirt clung to her skin, a ridiculous reminder of her current reality. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the exhaustion of a restless night. She needed fresh air. She needed out of this room. She opened the door and padded barefoot down the short hallway. Richard stood in the kitchen. He wore the same dark gray dress shirt from yesterday, the sleeves pushed high up his corded forearms. He stood by the granite counter, pouring black coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. The rich, bitter aroma filled the open space. "Morning, boss," Richard said, not looking up. Cynthia scowled at the nickname. She scanned the floor and spotted her bright yellow rubber flip-flops. One sat by the wooden island stool where she left it. The other rested near the red steel toolbox still sitting on the floorboards. She slid her feet into the cheap rubber shoes. "I need to walk," Cynthia stated, crossing her arms. "Before cabin fever sets in and I decide to dismantle your stove." "I'll show you the perimeter," Richard offered. He handed her a steaming mug. They stepped out through the heavy oak front door, the brass hinge Richard installed gleaming in the light. The tropical heat hit them in an instant. Thick green vines twisted up the trunks of towering palm trees. The air tasted of salt and damp soil. They walked down a narrow dirt trail leading behind the cabin. The canopy above filtered the sun into spotted patches on the ground. "Push him down!" her inner wolf snarled, clawing at the cage in her mind. "Claim him in the mud! Bite his neck!" Cynthia gripped her coffee mug with both hands. She forced her eyes forward, focusing on the dirt path. She needed a distraction from the wild beast tearing at her sanity. "Federal Aviation Regulation Part 121, Cynthia recited aloud. Her voice cut through the loud hum of jungle insects. "Requires all commercial aircraft to carry up-to-date emergency medical kits." Richard shot her a sideways glance. He ducked under a low-hanging palm frond. Are you quoting rulebooks at me? Regulation Part 91 dictates visual flight rules, Cynthia continued, her tone crisp and unyielding. Pilots must maintain specific cloud clearances at all times. Richard stopped walking. He turned to face her. The narrow trail forced them close together. The heat radiating off his chest wrapped around her, thicker than the island humidity. Roll over, his wolf yelped, tail thumping a frantic beat in his head. Show her our belly. Let her scratch our ears. Richard locked his inner beast away. He focused on the woman standing before him. She quoted federal laws to build an invisible wall between them. He found her tactics brilliant and entirely futile. Does quoting the law make you feel safe? Richard asked. His voice dropped, vibrating with quiet power. It keeps things structured, Cynthia countered. She took a step back. Her yellow flip-flops crunched on dry leaves. You lack structure. You hijack flights and lock doors. You act on pure impulse. I act on certainty, Richard corrected. He stepped closer, erasing the gap she just created. I saw exactly what I wanted. I took the necessary steps to secure it. Cynthia shook her head, holding the mug like a shield. You took a hostage. I brought my mate to a safe place, Richard said. The word hung in the air. Mate. She refused to acknowledge the truth of it. She turned on her heel and marched down the trail. They walked in silence for another 10 minutes until the tree line broke. They stepped out onto a stretch of pristine white sand. The ocean stretched out before them, endless and deep blue. Waves crashed against the shore with a rhythmic roar. Cynthia stared at the water. No boats, no docks, just miles of open sea. The reality of her isolation crashed down on her. There is no way off this rock, Cynthia murmured, the fight draining from her voice for a fraction of a second. Not until we finish our conversation, Richard agreed. He stood beside her, watching the horizon. I manage an entire territory, Cynthia. I deal with threats, border disputes, and politics every single day. I do not take vacations. I do not abandon my post. But you walked onto that plane and everything else stopped mattering. Cynthia looked at him. The ocean breeze ruffled his dark hair. He did not look arrogant now. He looked tired. He looked like a man carrying an entire world on his back. He needs us, her wolf whined, pacing with sudden anxiety. Comfort him. You have a terrible way of showing affection, Cynthia told him, turning back to the water. I'm learning, Richard replied, and we have plenty of time. Cynthia took a sip of her coffee. The morning sun climbed higher, baking the sand beneath her feet. She survived rude passengers, turbulence, and grueling shifts. She would survive this alpha. She just had to keep her walls up. Chapter 10. By late afternoon, the island climate turned hostile. The clear blue sky mutated into a bruised, violent purple. Wind whipped through the palm trees, tearing loose fronds from their branches. The temperature dropped, replacing the suffocating heat with a sharp, biting chill. Cynthia stood in the cabin living room. She watched the tree line thrash through the large glass windows. The ocean roar transformed from a soothing hum into a deafening crash. Richard walked out of the hallway. He had discarded his dress shirt, wearing only a plain black undershirt and his gray suit pants. The change in clothing highlighted the thick cords of muscle in his arms and shoulders. Look at his shoulders, her wolf barked. Climb him like a tree. Cynthia forced her gaze away from his chest. That doesn't look like a standard rain shower. It's a tropical squall, Richard stated. He walked to the front door and engaged the deadbolt. They hit fast and hit hard. We need to secure the exterior. A loud boom of thunder shook the wooden floorboards. The lights above the granite kitchen counter flickered, buzzed, and died. The refrigerator hums stopped. The cabin plunged into dim, gray shadows. Generator just tripped, Richard noted, unfazed by the sudden darkness. There are heavy storm shutters mounted on the outside of every window. They run on a metal track, but they rust easily. I need your help to pull them shut before the glass blows inward." Cynthia didn't argue. She didn't quote a rule book. When an emergency hit, her training kicked in. She kicked off her yellow flip-flops, preferring bare feet for better traction. "Tell me what to do," Cynthia said, her voice dropping all traces of sarcasm. Richard opened the front door. The wind roared into the cabin, knocking a ceramic mug off the counter. It shattered on the floor. Neither of them flinched. "Follow me," Richard ordered. They stepped out onto the porch. The rain had not started yet, but the air felt thick with impending water. Richard moved to the large living room window. A thick black iron shutter sat pushed to the side, rusted onto its metal track. Richard gripped the iron handle. He planted his boots against the wooden siding and pulled. The metal shrieked, grinding against the rust, but it only moved an inch. "Grab the bottom lip," Richard instructed over the howling wind. "When I count to 3, pull with everything you have." Cynthia crouched down. Her bare feet gripped the rough porch wood. She wrapped her fingers around the bottom edge of the iron shutter. The metal felt cold and unforgiving. "1," Richard yelled. 2, 3. Cynthia yanked the iron backward. Richard threw his entire body weight into the pull. The rusted wheels screamed in protest. The shutter slid forward a foot. "Again!" Richard shouted. They fell into a brutal rhythm. Pull, slide, reset. Cynthia felt a splinter bite into her heel, but she ignored the sting. Her muscles burned. The neon-pink fabric of her shirt clung to her sweating back. Beside her, Richard worked like a machine. His jaw locked tight. Veins bulged along his forearms. "Strong mate," his wolf cheered, ignoring the impending storm. "She works hard. Build the den together." They slammed the first shutter into place. Richard reached up and threw the locking latch. 3 more, he yelled, pointing to the other windows wrapping around the cabin. The first drops of rain fell. They hit the porch like icy bullets. Within seconds, the sky opened up. A torrential downpour blinded them. The wind pushed against them, an invisible wall of force. Cynthia ran to the next window. The rain plastered her hair to her face. She grabbed the metal lip of the second shutter. Richard took the handle. They pulled in unison. The shared physical strain connected them, a silent communication of effort and survival. Her wolf didn't demand she bite him. It demanded she fight the storm beside him. They locked the second shutter, then the third. By the time they reached the final window near the kitchen, the storm raged at full strength. Cynthia slipped on the wet porch wood. Her knee slammed into the deck. Richard abandoned the iron handle. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders. The rain washed over his face, flattening his dark hair against his forehead. "Are you hurt?" Richard demanded, his voice slicing through the thunder. "Just slipped," Cynthia yelled back. She pushed herself up, ignoring the dull ache in her kneecap. "Get the shutter!" They grabbed the iron together. With one final heave, they dragged the metal shield across the glass. Richard slammed the latch down. "Inside!" he ordered. He grabbed her hand, his large fingers wrapping around hers. The contact sent a jolt of pure heat up her arm, cutting right through the freezing rain. He pulled her toward the heavy oak door. They tumbled into the dark cabin. Richard shoved the door shut, throwing the deadbolt. The roaring storm became a muffled, distant drumbeat against the thick walls. The cabin plunged back into heavy silence, broken only by their ragged breathing. Chapter 11. Water dripped from Cynthia's soaked clothes, forming a dark puddle on the wooden floorboards. The interior of the cabin felt like a tomb. Complete darkness swallowed the corners of the room. The iron shutters blocked out every ounce of natural light. Richard released her hand. The sudden loss of his body heat made her shiver. "Stay put," Richard commanded, his voice a steady anchor in the pitch black. "I know where the supplies are." Cynthia heard his heavy footsteps move across the room. A cabinet door opened. A moment later, the sharp strike of a match cut through the dark. A small yellow flame flared to life. Richard held the match to a thick white pillar candle on the granite kitchen counter. The candle cast a warm, flickering glow across his face. He pulled a second candle from the drawer, lit it, and carried it to the gray sectional sofa. "Take this," Richard said, tossing a large, dry gray blanket toward her. Cynthia caught the thick fabric. She peeled the wet, neon-pink tourist shirt away from her skin, shivering as the damp denim shorts clung to her legs. She wrapped the blanket tightly around her shoulders, creating a cocoon of warmth. She walked over to the sofa and sat down, pulling her knees to her chest. Richard walked down the short hallway. He returned a minute later wearing a dry black t-shirt. He dragged the red steel toolbox out of the way with his boot and sat on the opposite end of the long sectional. The storm battered the cabin walls, a relentless assault of wind and water. Cynthia watched the candle flame dance. The adrenaline from the porch faded, leaving a strange, quiet intimacy in its wake. There were no aviation rules to quote. There were no distractions, just two people trapped in a room. "You bleed," Richard noted, pointing a finger at her foot. Cynthia looked down. A small cut on her heel, right where the wood splinter caught her on the porch, oozed a single drop of red. It was nothing. A paper cut. "Lick it," his wolf whined, pacing in distress. "Heal the mate. Bring her a bandage." "I stepped on a splinter," Cynthia said, tucking her foot deeper under the blanket. "I'll survive." Richard didn't push the issue. He leaned his head back against the sofa cushions and stared at the dark ceiling. The silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded. "You asked earlier why I hijacked your flight," Richard spoke, his voice low and devoid of his usual alpha command. "You called it a tantrum." "It looked like one," Cynthia replied, keeping her tone even. "My pack spans 3 cities," Richard said, ignoring her barb. "I manage hundreds of wolves. I negotiate treaties with neighboring territories. I settle land disputes. I execute rogues who threaten our borders. Every decision I make impacts lives. If I show weakness, my rivals attack. If I show hesitation, my people lose faith." Cynthia watched his profile in the candlelight. She saw the rigid set of his jaw, the heavy lines of responsibility etched around his eyes. He wasn't complaining. He was stating facts. "That sounds exhausting," Cynthia murmured. "It is a cage," Richard admitted. He turned his head, locking his dark eyes on her. "I spend every waking hour calculating my next move. I never drop my guard. But when you handed me that trash bag and insulted my airplane, my mind went completely quiet." Cynthia swallowed hard. The feral beast in her chest stopped pacing. It sat down, listening to the mate bare his soul. "You didn't see an alpha," Richard continued, his voice rough. "You saw an arrogant man sitting in a cramped seat. You treated me like a normal person. You didn't cower. You didn't ask me for favors. You just demanded I follow the safety protocols." Cynthia clutched the gray blanket tighter. She wanted to throw a sarcastic comment at him. She wanted to rebuild the wall. But the words died in her throat. She saw the raw honesty in his expression. "You possess a terrible interior decorator," Cynthia whispered, the fight completely gone from her voice. Richard let out a soft, genuine laugh. It warmed the dark room. "I'll fire them tomorrow." "The bar cart is a death trap," Cynthia added, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I'll throw it out the cargo door," Richard promised. He shifted on the sofa, closing the distance between them. He stopped a foot away, respecting the boundary she established. The scent of toasted almonds and fresh pine needles washed over her, grounding her in the present moment. "I didn't bring you here to punish you, Cynthia," Richard said softly. "I brought you here because I needed the noise to stop, and you are the only one who can make it stop." Cynthia looked into his eyes. She saw the steady leader, the protector, the man who fixed doors and pulled shutters in the rain. She realized her professional armor was cracking, piece by piece. Chapter 12. Hours bled into the night. The violent howling of the storm slowly dialed back to a steady, rhythmic rain against the wooden roof. The 2 candles burned low, casting wavering shadows across the living room walls. Cynthia remained curled under the gray blanket on the sectional sofa. Richard sat inches away. The physical distance between them felt charged, like a live wire ready to spark. Her inner wolf stretched, purring in the back of her mind. He protects us. He talks to us. Claim him now. Bite his lip. Cynthia didn't silence the beast this time. She felt too tired to fight a war on 2 fronts. The cold dampness of her denim shorts uncomfortable against her skin, she shifted her weight. The blanket slipped, exposing her bare shoulder. Richard's eyes tracked the movement. His gaze dropped to her collarbone, lingering on the pulse beating rapidly at the base of her throat. The dim light highlighted the sharp angle of his jaw. "The rain is stopping," Cynthia whispered. Her voice sounded far too loud in the quiet cabin. "It will pass completely by dawn," Richard replied. He didn't look at the window. He kept his focus entirely on her. Cynthia let the silence return. She studied his face, cataloging the small details she missed while fighting him. The slight crook in his nose, a remnant of an old fight. The dark stubble shadowing his chin. He was a dangerous man, capable of violence, yet he sat perfectly still, letting her set the pace. "Smell his neck," her wolf urged. "Get closer." Without thinking, Cynthia leaned forward. The invisible thread of the mate bond pulled tight, reeling her in. Richard caught the shift in her posture. His breath hitched. His inner wolf, usually a chaotic mess of tail wags and frantic demands, went dead silent. The animal recognized the critical moment. Richard mirrored her movement. He leaned in. The space between them vanished. Cynthia felt the heat of his skin. She smelled the pine and roasted almonds, rich and intoxicating. His gaze dropped to her lips. She saw the raw hunger in his eyes, restrained by a wall of iron willpower. He raised a hand. His large, calloused fingers gently brushed a damp strand of hair away from her cheek. The touch sent a shockwave of electricity straight down her spine. Cynthia gasped softly, her eyelids fluttering shut. "Cynthia," Richard murmured. His voice was a physical caress, deep and rough. He leaned closer. His lips hovered a fraction of an inch from hers. She felt his warm breath sweep across her mouth. Her wolf howled in triumph, ready to seal the bond, ready to surrender the sky for the dirt. But as his lips brushed hers, a sudden, sharp thought pierced through the haze of desire. Hostage, kidnapped, trapped. Cynthia opened her eyes. The professional armor, battered and dented, slammed back into place. She was a flight attendant who controlled her own life. She was not a prize won by a billionaire throwing his weight around. She refused to let a biological scent dictate her future. Cynthia jerked her head back, breaking the contact. She scrambled backward on the sofa, clutching the gray blanket tightly to her chest. Her chest heaved as she dragged oxygen into her burning lungs. Richard froze. His hand remained suspended in the air for a single second before he slowly lowered it to his knee. He didn't lunge. He didn't try to force her back. "No," Cynthia said. Her voice trembled, betraying the fierce facade she tried to project. "I'm not doing this." Richard watched her, his expression unreadable in the candlelight. "Doing what?" "I'm not falling into your lap just because nature says we match," Cynthia snapped, her defensive anger flaring to life. "You locked me in a metal tube. You dragged me to the jungle. You don't get a reward for holding me hostage." Richard's jaw tightened. "I wasn't looking for a reward. I was looking at my mate." "I am not your mate!" Cynthia yelled, the denial tearing out of her throat. The words hung in the air, heavy and false. They both knew it was a lie, but Cynthia needed the lie to survive. She threw the gray blanket off her legs and stood up. She ignored the yellow flip-flops near the kitchen island. She marched barefoot down the dark hallway. She reached the bedroom, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. She slammed the door shut and twisted the lock with a loud, final click. Richard sat alone on the sofa. The candle on the coffee table flickered and burned out, plunging the living room into total darkness. His wolf let out a long, mournful whine. She ran away. We failed. Bring her a shiny rock. Richard dropped his head into his hands. He rubbed his temples, feeling the dull ache of a severe headache building behind his eyes. He pushed her too fast. He let the bond override his logic. He sat in the dark, listening to the final drops of rain hit the roof, knowing the real battle had just begun. Chapter 13. Dawn broke over the island. The storm vanished, leaving behind a humid, thick heat. Inside the cabin, shadows clung to the corners. The heavy iron shutters remained locked over the windows, blocking the morning sun. The generator stayed dead. Cynthia lay awake on the king-sized mattress. She stared at the wooden ceiling. Her muscles ached. The memory of the night before played on a loop in her mind. The candlelight, the distance closing between them, the heat of Richard's skin, the near kiss. Coward, her inner wolf growled, pacing the confines of her mind. You ran. You denied the mate. Weak human. I kept my job, Cynthia whispered to the empty room. I kept my boundaries. Boundaries do not keep you warm, the beast snapped back. Cynthia threw off the plain white quilt. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. Her bare feet hit the cold floorboards. The cut on her heel throbbed a little, a dull reminder of the rusted shutters. She smoothed down the wrinkled fabric of the neon pink tourist shirt. She hated this outfit. It felt like a neon sign broadcasting her loss of control. She twisted the lock and opened the bedroom door. Richard stood by the front entrance. He wore his black undershirt and gray suit pants. The red steel toolbox sat open at his feet. He held a metal crowbar in his right hand. He looked up when the bedroom door creaked. His eyes gave nothing away. No anger, no hurt, just steady, calculating alpha focus. Morning, Richard said. His voice carried a rough edge. What are you doing? Cynthia asked. She crossed her arms, keeping her distance. The storm jammed the iron shutters, Richard explained. He wedged the crowbar under the metal lip of the living room window. Rust and salt water. I need to pry them open. He pushed down on the steel bar. His shoulders flexed under his shirt. With a loud, grinding screech, the iron shutter broke free. Sunlight flooded the living room, revealing the dust motes dancing in the air and the shattered pieces of the ceramic coffee mug still scattered across the floorboards. Cynthia squinted against the sudden brightness. Do we have food that doesn't require a stove? The power is still out. Pantry has canned fruit and bread, Richard answered. He moved to the next window. They did not discuss the near kiss. They skirted around the tension. Cynthia walked into the kitchen and grabbed a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. She worked in silence. She made 2 sandwiches, setting them on paper towels. Richard finished prying the last shutter open. He walked into the kitchen, set the crowbar on the granite counter, and picked up a sandwich. We need to check the island perimeter, Richard stated between bites. Storms wash debris onto the dirt runway. If my beta tries to land the jet, he needs a clear path. I can help clear branches, Cynthia offered. They finished their cold breakfast. Richard unlocked the heavy oak front door. They stepped out onto the porch. The jungle looked battered. Broken palm fronds littered the grass. They walked side by side down the narrow dirt trail leading north. Cynthia kept her eyes on the path, avoiding the yellow flip-flops she left inside. Bare feet felt better in the mud anyway. They reached the tree line near the north beach. The ocean lay calm, a stark contrast to the violence of the night before. Richard stopped walking. He froze in his tracks. His head snapped up, his nostrils flared. Cynthia watched his posture change. The calm, patient man vanished. The alpha emerged. His spine locked rigid, his hands curled into tight fists. What is it? Cynthia asked, her pulse kicking into a faster gear. Rotting meat and wet fur, Richard murmured. He stepped in front of her, shielding her body with his own. His inner wolf let out a deep, rumbling snarl. Intruders! Protect the den! Cynthia looked past his broad shoulder. A rusted, dented fishing boat sat beached on the white sand. It lacked any registration numbers. The hull scraped against the shore. 4 men jumped over the side of the boat. They hit the wet sand. They wore ragged clothes. Scars marked their faces and arms. They did not move like humans. They moved with a twitchy, feral energy. Rogues, wolf shifters without a pack. They survived by stealing from established territories. "They smell the supply shed," Richard stated. "They came to scavenge after the storm." Cynthia felt the wild beast in her chest rise up. The hair on her arms stood on end. "Enemy!" her wolf shrieked. "Bite them!" The roads spotted Richard standing at the edge of the jungle. They stopped moving. A tense, dangerous silence fell over the beach. "Go back to the cabin," Richard ordered. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the threats. Cynthia planted her feet in the dirt. The aviation rulebook offered 0 guidance for this scenario. Chapter 14. "I am not leaving," Cynthia said. Richard turned his head a fraction of an inch, his dark eyes locked onto hers. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He used the pure, raw weight of an alpha command. "This is not a negotiation, Cynthia," Richard said. 4 desperate rogues stand on that beach. They fight dirty. They want the pack supplies in the shed, and they will kill anyone in their way. Walk back to the cabin. Lock the heavy oak door. Do not come out." His inner wolf paced with frantic, protective energy. "Hide the mate. Keep her safe. We will tear out their throats." Cynthia swallowed hard. The authority in his tone hit her with a physical force. Most humans would turn and run, but Cynthia held her ground. She fought the urge to argue. She knew he needed clear focus to survive this encounter. 4 against 1, Cynthia pointed out, her voice tight. "Those are terrible odds, even for a pack leader." "I handle my territory," Richard replied. "Go." He reached down and grabbed the hem of his black undershirt. He pulled the fabric over his head and tossed it into the bushes. He stood bare-chested in the morning sun. Scars laced across his ribs and shoulders, proof of past battles. He stepped out of the tree line and walked onto the open white sand. Cynthia retreated 2 steps into the jungle shade, but she refused to head back to the cabin. She crouched behind a thick fern, watching the scene unfold. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The 4 rogues spread out in a half-circle, trying to flank Richard. The leader, a tall man with a missing left ear, let out a harsh laugh. "Look what the storm washed up," the rogue leader sneered. He sniffed the air. "The big alpha himself, playing house on the reserve island." Richard did not slow his pace. He walked right toward the center of the group. "You crossed into my borders," Richard said. His voice carried over the sound of the crashing waves. "Get back in your rusted boat. Push off the sand. If you leave now, you keep your lives." The rogues laughed. It sounded like a pack of hyenas. "We smell the meat in the shed," another rogue spat, pulling a long steel knife from his belt. "We smell the fresh bread. We take what we want." "You take nothing," Richard promised. The rogue with the knife lunged forward. He aimed a vicious slash at Richard's stomach. Richard dodged the blade with terrifying speed. He caught the rogue's wrist, twisted the bone until a loud snap echoed across the beach, and shoved the man backward into the sand. The rogue screamed, dropping the steel weapon. "Shift," Richard ordered the remaining 3. "Face me like wolves." The leader snarled. "Kill him! Take the supplies! Then we hunt the woman hiding in the trees. I smell her sweet scent." A cold spike of pure rage ripped through Richard. His inner wolf exploded. "They hunt the mate. Death! Death to all of them!" Richard let the change take him. He did not hold back. His bones cracked and elongated. Muscles shifted under his skin. Dark gray fur erupted across his body. The transformation took less than 2 seconds. Where a man just stood, a towering, monstrous wolf now crouched in the sand. Richard let out a deafening roar. It shook the palm leaves. The 3 remaining rogues dropped to the sand, their bodies twisting and breaking as they shifted into their own wolf forms. They were scrawny, matted beasts, driven by hunger and desperation. The fight began. Richard charged the leader. The 2 massive wolves collided in a blur of teeth and claws. Sand sprayed into the air. Richard clamped his jaws around the leader's shoulder, tossing the rogue aside like a rag doll. But the other 2 rogues attacked his flanks. One bit into Richard's back leg. The other slashed at his ribs. Richard spun, throwing them off, but they coordinated their strikes. Cynthia watched from the ferns. Her human logic burned away. The safety protocols, the flight rules, the professional distance, all of it turned to ash. She saw a rogue circle around Richard's blind spot, ready to go for his throat. "Defend the mate!" her inner wolf shrieked. It shattered the mental cage. The wild beast took control. Cynthia grabbed the hem of her neon-pink shirt and yanked it over her head. She unbuttoned the tight denim shorts and kicked them away. She stood in the damp jungle dirt, feeling the wild pulse of the earth beneath her feet. "Nobody hunts me," Cynthia snarled. Chapter 15. Cynthia gave in to the change. She felt her spine arch. Heat flooded her veins. Her jaw lengthened, teeth sharpening into lethal points. Sleek amber fur ripped through her skin. The transformation felt like a burst of pure, unbridled freedom. She spent years forcing the beast into a tiny box to serve drinks and pass out peanuts. Now, the box was gone. A fierce, golden-eyed wolf stood in the shadows of the jungle. On the beach, Richard fought a brutal war. He shook a brown rogue off his back leg, tossing the beast into the shallow surf. But the leader with the missing ear recovered. The rogue charged Richard's exposed flank, jaws snapping toward his neck. Cynthia burst from the tree line. She hit the sand with blinding speed. She did not hesitate. She launched herself through the air, a missile of amber fur and muscle. She slammed into the rogue leader just before his teeth reached Richard's throat. The impact sent both wolves tumbling across the white sand. Cynthia scrambled to her paws in a flash. She stood over the rogue, baring her fangs. A deep, menacing growl rattled in her chest. Richard spun around. His dark eyes widened in shock. He expected Cynthia to hide in the cabin. He expected a terrified flight attendant. Instead, a stunning, fierce amber wolf stood beside him, guarding his flank. "Mate!" Richard's inner wolf cheered, the joy cutting right through the bloodlust of battle. "Strong mate! She fights for us!" Cynthia shot Richard a quick glance. Her golden eyes communicated a clear message. "I do not hide." The rogues regained their footing. They realized their target just doubled. They faced 2 healthy, powerful wolves instead of 1 tired alpha. The leader shook the sand from his matted fur. He let out a sharp bark, signaling the attack. The 3 rogues charged at once. Richard met the leader head-on. They clashed in the center of the beach, biting and tearing. Richard used his superior weight to pin the rogue down, aiming a punishing bite at the enemy's shoulder. Cynthia took the other 2. She lacked Richard's towering size, but she possessed incredible speed. A scrawny gray rogue lunged for her legs. Cynthia sidestepped the attack. She snapped her jaws, catching the rogue by the scruff of the neck. She used his own momentum to throw him face first into the dirt. The second rogue, a mud-colored beast, jumped at her back. Cynthia dropped low. The rogue sailed over her head. Richard saw the opening. He abandoned the leader for a fraction of a second, reached out, and swatted the mud-colored rogue out of the air with a massive paw. They fought in perfect sync. They moved like 2 halves of the same weapon. Where Richard brought raw power, Cynthia brought precision and speed. They covered each other's blind spots. They communicated through instinct and the crackling electricity of the mate bond. A rogue managed to scratch Cynthia across the flank. Richard saw the blood. His protective rage boiled over. He grabbed the offending rogue by the throat, lifted the beast off the ground, and threw him 10 feet across the beach. The rogue hit the side of the rusted fishing boat with a loud, hollow thud. The leader realized the fight was lost. His pack was battered, bleeding, and outmatched. He scrambled backward, letting out a high-pitched whine of defeat. The rogues turned tail. They sprinted for the boat. The man with the broken wrist dragged himself over the side. The others followed, pushing the rusted hull off the sand and into the waves. Cynthia chased them to the water's edge. She stood in the surf, water rushing over her paws. She let out a triumphant howl, claiming the victory. Richard walked up beside her. He bumped his large, dark shoulder against hers. "We won!" his wolf barked. "Good job!" They stood side by side, watching the boat disappear into the horizon. The threat was gone. The island belonged to them again. Chapter 16. The adrenaline began to fade. The roar of the ocean filled the silence left by the fleeing rogues. Cynthia turned away from the water. Her chest heaved with heavy pants. The amber fur on her flank held a small streak of red from the minor scratch, but the pain felt distant. She felt alive. She felt wild. Richard stood a few feet away. He watched her. His dark wolf form looked intimidating, covered in sand and minor scrapes, but his eyes held deep reverence. "Shift back," Richard communicated through the silent bond they shared. Cynthia closed her eyes. She focused on her breathing, pulling the feral energy back into her core. The shift back to human form took a heavy toll. Bones realigned, fur vanished into skin. She dropped to her knees in the sand, gasping for air. She was completely bare, her clothes still sitting in a pile near the tree line. She wrapped her arms around her chest, shivering as the sea breeze hit her hot skin. Richard shifted a second later. He landed on one knee, breathing hard. He stood up, ignoring his own lack of clothing. He walked to the tree line, grabbed his discarded black undershirt, and returned to Cynthia. He knelt beside her. He wrapped the black fabric over her shoulders, covering her. "You did not stay in the cabin," Richard said. His voice was a raspy whisper. "I do not sit on the sidelines," Cynthia answered. She clutched the shirt tight. She looked up at him. The air between them changed. The fight stripped away the last remnants of her professional armor. She could not quote an aviation rule to explain what just happened. She fought beside an alpha. She matched his rhythm. The wild beast inside her chest no longer paced in a cage. It sat content, leaning against the bars, waiting for her to accept reality. The scent of wild jasmine and sweet citrus rolled off her skin, mixing perfectly with his toasted almonds and fresh pine needles. Richard closed his eyes for a second, inhaling her scent. It grounded him. "You fought like a born Luna," Richard murmured. He reached out. His calloused fingers brushed a clump of wet sand from her cheek. "You saved my flank." "You threw a wolf into a boat for scratching me," Cynthia countered. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of the bond pulling them together. "I protect what belongs to me," Richard stated. The words did not anger her this time. The kidnapping, the locked doors, the ridiculous island standoff, it all led to this beach. She saw the truth. He did not want a hostage, he wanted an equal. "Claim him," her inner wolf whispered. It was not a feral demand anymore, it was a request. Cynthia dropped her defenses. She reached up and grabbed the back of Richard's neck. She pulled him down. Their lips met. The kiss hit like a lightning strike. It erased the sand, the island, and the lingering sting of battle. Richard let out a low groan, wrapping his thick arms around her waist and pulling her against his chest. He tasted like salt and rain. He kissed her with the desperate hunger of a man who waited his entire life to find his other half. Cynthia kissed him back, pouring all her stubborn fire into the embrace. The mate bond snapped fully into place. It locked down deep in their souls, a permanent tether tying them together. Richard pulled back just enough to look into her golden brown eyes. "No more running," Richard ordered softly. "No more running," Cynthia agreed. He stood up, scooping her into his arms. He carried her away from the water, past the pile of discarded neon clothes, and marched up the dirt trail. The fight was over. The standoff was finished. The Alpha finally caught his flight attendant, and Cynthia realized she never wanted to leave the ground again. Chapter 17. Richard carried Cynthia away from the crashing waves. He marched up the dirt trail leading into the dense green jungle. The heat of the morning sun baked the damp earth beneath his bare feet. He held her tight against his broad chest. His arms, wrapped in thick cords of muscle, offered an unyielding shield against the rest of the world. Cynthia rested her head against his shoulder. The scent of toasted almonds and fresh pine needles filled her lungs. It anchored her. 10 minutes ago, she operated on pure survival instinct. She shifted. She fought a rogue wolf in the sand. She tasted blood and victory. Now, the feral energy drained from her veins. The crash hit her like a punch to the gut. Her hands began to tremble. Her heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. The adrenaline left her system, leaving behind raw exhaustion and a dull, burning ache along her right flank. "We fought well," her inner wolf murmured. The beast sounded tired, curling into a content ball in the back of her mind. "The mate saw our strength. He respects us." "Put me down," Cynthia ordered. Her voice lacked its usual crisp customer service bite. It sounded breathless and rough. Richard stopped walking. The canopy of palm trees cast dark shadows over his face. He looked down at her. His dark eyes held a fierce, protective fire. "Keep her close," his inner wolf barked. "Carry the mate to the den. Build a nest." Richard ignored the demand in his head. He understood the woman in his arms. She possessed a spine of steel. She demanded control over her own 2 feet. He lowered her to the ground. Cynthia's bare feet sank into the damp jungle dirt. Her knees buckled for a fraction of a second. Richard caught her waist, his large hand steadying her balance. She gripped his bare forearm, feeling the heat radiating off his skin. She wore his oversized black undershirt. The fabric hung past her thighs, offering a small layer of armor against the elements. "You took a hit," Richard stated. He kept his hand anchored on her hip, right above the scratch on her flank. "I traded a scratch for a clear shot at the rogue," Cynthia countered. She forced her spine straight. She let go of his arm and took a deliberate step forward. The sting flared, but she ignored it. "It was a tactical exchange. I calculate risks for a living." "You calculate flight paths," Richard corrected. He stepped beside her, matching her slow pace up the trail. "You do not calculate wilderness combat. You took a massive risk stepping onto that beach." Cynthia shot him a sharp look. "You told me to hide in the cabin. I do not hide. I protect my crew. Out here, you are my crew." A low rumble of amusement vibrated in Richard's chest. The tension lines around his mouth softened. He liked her defiance. He loved her courage. "You protected my blind spot," Richard said. The humor faded, replaced by stark honesty. "The leader had an opening. He aimed for my throat. You closed the gap before I could turn." "I did my job," Cynthia said. "You did more than that," Richard replied. He stopped walking. He reached out and cupped her face in his calloused palms. The tropical wind ceased. The jungle went silent. The mate bond, an invisible tether between them, pulled taut. It no longer felt like a wild, feral urge. It felt profound. It felt deliberate. Cynthia stared into his dark eyes. She saw the alpha who managed territories and executed threats. She also saw the man who fixed broken doors and surrendered the only bed in the cabin. She stopped fighting the pull. Her remaining defenses vanished. The heavy weight of her solitary life dissolved into the humid air. "We need to clean that scratch," Richard murmured, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "I have a first aid kit in my bag," Cynthia answered. They resumed their walk. They reached the clearing a few minutes later. The sturdy wooden cabin stood resolute under the morning sun. The heavy oak front door remained wide open. The iron shutters, pried apart earlier by Richard's crowbar, let rectangles of bright light spill across the porch. Cynthia walked up the wooden steps. She stepped into the living room. The shattered pieces of the ceramic coffee mug still littered the floorboards near the dark granite counters. Her bright yellow rubber flip-flops sat abandoned by the island stool. The battle changed the environment. The cabin no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a sanctuary. Richard closed the heavy oak door behind them. The brass hinge operated smooth and silent. He engaged the deadbolt. The lock clicked with a resonant thud. They stood alone in the quiet space. The outside world faded away. The adrenaline crash finished its course, leaving nothing but the undeniable truth of the bond. Chapter 18. Sunlight poured through the unblocked windows, warming the gray sectional sofa. The cabin remained quiet, absent of the roaring wind from the previous night. Richard walked to the hallway. "Sit on the sofa. I will get the supplies." Cynthia moved to the living room. She bypassed the broken ceramic shards on the floorboards. She sat on the edge of the gray cushions. The black undershirt shifted, exposing the angry red scratch along her side. The rogue's claws tore through the top layer of skin. It stung with a sharp, burning heat. Richard returned a minute later. He carried a small white plastic first aid box and a damp white hand towel. He dropped to one knee in front of her. He did not ask permission. He reached out and pushed the hem of the black shirt up, exposing her right flank. "Touch her," his inner wolf yipped, tail thumping a joyous rhythm. "Heal the mate. Bring her snacks." Richard ignored the eager beast. He focused on the wound. He took the damp towel and wiped the dried dirt and sand away from the torn skin. His touch remained gentle, a stark contrast to the brutal force he used on the beach. Cynthia inhaled a sharp breath as the cool water hit the scratch. "Hold still," Richard murmured. He opened the plastic box, pulling out a small bottle of antiseptic and a cotton pad. "It looks worse than it feels," Cynthia lied. She gripped the edge of the gray sofa. Richard pressed the soaked cotton to her side. The chemical sting flared hot. Cynthia gritted her teeth. She refused to pull away. She survived worse turbulence. "The rogues fight with dirty claws," Richard explained. He taped a white gauze pad over the clean wound. "Infection is the real threat. The bleeding stopped. You heal fast." He finished the bandage. He did not stand up. He stayed on one knee, his face inches from her waist. He rested his large hands on her bare knees. The heat of his palms seeped into her skin. Cynthia looked down at him, the broad shoulders, the dark hair swept across his forehead, the fierce, unyielding devotion in his eyes. "The inspection is over," Cynthia whispered. Richard lifted his head. He met her golden brown gaze. "You stopped quoting the aviation rulebook," Richard noted. His voice dropped to a rough, deep register. "The rules do not apply here," Cynthia admitted. She let go of the sofa edge. She reached out and buried her fingers in his dark hair. The final barrier cracked and shattered. Richard surged upward. He crowded her into the back of the sofa cushions. He caged her in with his arms, his chest pressing against hers. The scent of wild jasmine and sweet citrus hijacked his senses. "Claim her," his inner wolf roared, a triumphant sound that rattled his bones. Cynthia met him halfway. She pulled his mouth down to hers. The kiss carried zero hesitation. It burned with raw, consuming fire. Richard tasted her surrender and gave his own in return. He dominated boardrooms and battlefields, but he yielded his soul to the woman in his arms. He trailed kisses down her jawline. His lips brushed the pulse point at the base of her throat. "Mine," Richard growled against her skin. "Yours," Cynthia agreed. She tilted her head back, offering him the choice. Richard opened his mouth. His fangs descended, sharp and lethal. He pressed his teeth against the junction of her neck and shoulder. He did not bite with violence. He bit with a profound, sacred promise. The fangs pierced her skin. A jolt of pure electricity arched down Cynthia's spine. The mate bond locked. The invisible tether solidified into a steel cable, binding their lives, their strength, and their wolves together. Cynthia let out a breathless gasp. Her inner wolf purred, a deep and resonant sound that echoed in the quiet cabin. Mate, forever. Richard withdrew his fangs. He ran his tongue over the puncture wounds, sealing the mark with his saliva. The sting faded into a warm, pulsing throb. He pulled back, his chest heaving. He stared at the fresh claiming mark on her neck. A fierce, possessive pride radiated from his dark eyes. He leaned his forehead against hers. No more running. I never run, Cynthia whispered. I take a dominant position and hold my ground. Richard let out a rough laugh. He scooped her into his arms, lifting her off the gray sofa. He bypassed the yellow flip-flops and the broken ceramic mug. He carried her down the short hallway toward the bedroom. The island standoff concluded. The alpha won his mate, and Cynthia won a partner who matched her fire. The rest of the day vanished behind the closed bedroom door. The jungle outside reclaimed its quiet rhythm. The sun tracked across the sky, dipping below the ocean horizon. Darkness fell over the cabin, but inside, the shadows held no power. They found their light in each other. Chapter 19. A thunderous roar rattled the cabin windows. Cynthia opened her eyes. Morning sunlight streamed through the bedroom glass, casting bright geometric shapes across the plain white quilt. The noise grew louder, vibrating through the wooden floorboards. It was a familiar sound, jet engines. Richard lay beside her. He rested on his stomach, one heavy arm draped over her waist. He cracked an eye open. Gideon, Richard murmured, his voice thick with sleep. He cleared the storm. Cynthia sat up. The quilt pooled around her waist. She touched her neck. The claiming mark throbbed with a dull, pleasant heat. It felt like a permanent piece of jewelry. Your beta possesses excellent timing, Cynthia said. She pushed his arm aside and slipped out of the broad, king-sized bed. She walked into the bathroom. She turned on the sink. The generator hummed to life in the distance. Gideon must have manually reset the breaker upon landing. She splashed cold water on her face. The woman staring back in the mirror looked different. The stiff, polite flight attendant vanished. A fierce, wild Lina looked back. She walked back into the bedroom and grabbed her navy blue overnight duffel bag. Cynthia left the ridiculous neon pink Beach Boss t-shirt and denim shorts in the jungle dirt where she shifted. She did not miss them. She grabbed the spare gray cabin blanket off the sofa and shoved it into the bottom of her bag instead. She reached for her tailored navy blue uniform. The fabric hung over the wooden chair in the corner. She slipped the stiff skirt over her hips. She buttoned the white blouse, adjusting the collar. The stiff fabric felt like armor. Before the island, she used the uniform to hide. Today, she used the uniform to command. Richard sat up in bed. He watched her dress. He admired the sharp lines of her outfit. She is a queen, his inner wolf yipped. Give her the jet. Give her the whole fleet. You look professional, Richard noted. He stood up, pulling on his tailored gray suit pants and a fresh white dress shirt he found in the closet. I am professional, Cynthia countered. She zipped the navy blue duffel bag. I also possess a union card and a grievance form with your name on it. Richard chuckled. Put it on my desk when we get back. They walked out of the bedroom. The living room looked like a war zone of their making. The red steel toolbox sat near the wall. The shattered ceramic mug remained in pieces on the floorboards. Cynthia grabbed her bright yellow flip-flops near the kitchen island and tossed them into her duffel bag. She retrieved her low heels and slipped them on her feet. They walked out the heavy oak front door. Richard locked it behind them. The morning air felt thick and humid. They walked down the dirt path. The jungle vines parted, revealing the long dirt landing strip. The sleek white jet sat idling on the rough runway. The metal gleamed under the sun. Gideon stood at the bottom of the boarding stairs. He wore his crisp pilot uniform. He watched them approach. His eyes darted to Richard, then shifted to Cynthia. He caught the shift in their dynamic. The fierce Luna energy radiated off her, perfectly intertwined with the Alpha's power. Gideon straightened his spine. He bowed his head. "Welcome back, Alpha," Gideon greeted. He turned his gaze to Cynthia, dipping his chin lower. "Luna, the plane is ready." Cynthia kept her chin level. She did not flinch at the title. "The landing gear needs a wash, Gideon. You collected half the jungle on the undercarriage." Gideon let out a bark of laughter. He looked at Richard with a wide grin. "She kept her edge." "She sharpens it daily," Richard replied. He placed a hand on the small of Cynthia's back. They walked up the metal stairs. Cynthia stepped inside the cabin. The environment contrasted sharply with the wild jungle they just left. The air conditioning blasted cool air. The burgundy velvet seats looked plush and untouched. The heavy gold-plated bar cart sat in the corner, sparkling under the recessed lighting. Cynthia dropped her navy blue duffel bag onto a velvet chair. "I want that cart gone before our next flight," Cynthia ordered, pointing at the gold hazard. "I will unbolt it myself," Richard promised. Gideon pulled the heavy cabin door shut. The lock clicked. The jet engines spooled up, preparing for takeoff. The island standoff finished its final chapter. The real world waited for them across the ocean. Chapter 20. The jet rocketed into the blue sky. The dirt runway and the dense green jungle vanished beneath a layer of white clouds. Cynthia sat in the burgundy velvet seat. On the flight to the island, she sat across the aisle, building an invisible fortress of safety regulations and sarcasm. Today, she sat on the right side of the custom leather sofa. Richard sat flush against her left side, his thigh pressed against hers. He held her hand. His thumb traced circles over her knuckles. "Hold her hand tighter," his inner wolf cheered, vibrating with endless joy. "Never let go! Best mate!" Richard allowed a small smile to touch his lips. He leaned his head against the headrest. "The pack elders expect my return this afternoon," Richard said. His tone shifted from relaxed to business. The Alpha took the reins. "They gather in the main estate. They want a report on the border dispute I missed." Cynthia looked at him. "The border dispute you skipped to kidnap a flight attendant?" "A necessary detour," Richard corrected. "But they hold traditional views. Elder Harmon runs the council. He expects a Luna born from a wealthy pack family. He expects a woman trained in pack politics and diplomacy." Cynthia raised an eyebrow. "And instead, he gets a woman who serves pretzels at 30,000 feet. "He gets a warrior who fought a rogue leader and won," Richard stated. His grip on her hand tightened. "But Harmon uses words like weapons. He will test your patience. He will insult your background. He expects you to bow your head." Cynthia let out a short, dismissive huff. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "Elder Harmon sounds like a first-class passenger who drank too much complimentary champagne," Cynthia said. She smoothed her navy blue uniform skirt. "I deal with entitled men every single shift. They yell, they demand extra pillows, and they threaten to fire me." Richard turned his head. He watched her profile. "And how do you handle them?" "I hand them a pillow, tell them the rules, and cut off their liquor supply," Cynthia answered. Her golden brown eyes flashed with unwavering confidence. "I do not bow my head to unruly passengers, Richard. I am not starting today." "Fierce mate," his wolf howled in approval. "I will handle Elder Harmon," Cynthia promised. She turned her body, facing him fully on the sofa. "You handle the border dispute. We run this pack together. I manage the interior, you manage the exterior." Richard felt a surge of awe. He spent years carrying the burden alone. He expected his mate to need protection from the vicious political games of the council. Instead, Cynthia plotted her strategy with the cold precision of a military general. "The interior decorators are fired," Richard agreed. "You possess full authority over the estate." "Good," Cynthia said. She glanced at the corner of the cabin. "Because the drapes in your estate better not match these hideous velvet seats." Richard let out a booming laugh. The sound bounced off the cabin walls, rich and carefree. Gideon, sitting in the cockpit, heard the laugh through the open comms. The beta smiled, steering the jet toward their home territory. Cynthia rested her head against Richard's broad shoulder. The solid warmth of his body grounded her. The flight back felt short. The turbulence hit once over the coast, rattling the gold-plated bar cart against the wall. "Hazard," Cynthia muttered, closing her eyes. "Gone by tomorrow," Richard vowed. The jet began its descent. The sprawling cityscape of Richard's territory came into view. Tall glass buildings and thick concrete roads replaced the wild green of the island. The reality of their new life rushed up to meet them. Cynthia felt the pressure building in her ears. She felt the beast in her chest stand up, shaking off its fatigue. Her inner wolf bared its teeth, ready to face the pack. The jet wheels touched down on the smooth concrete of the private hangar. The engines whined down to a low idle. Richard stood up. He grabbed her navy blue duffel bag. He offered his free hand to her. "Ready to meet the elders, boss?" Richard asked, a challenging spark in his dark eyes. Cynthia took his hand. She stood tall in her crisp uniform. She felt the claiming mark throb on her neck. She felt the unyielding certainty of the man standing beside her. "Open the door, Alpha," Cynthia said. "Let's show them how a real flight lands." Chapter 21. The jet wheels settled onto the smooth concrete of the private hangar. The engines spun down, replacing the familiar roar of flight with a thick, expectant silence. Cynthia stood near the cabin exit. She held the thick strap of her navy blue overnight duffel bag. Her crisp white blouse and tailored skirt felt like a suit of armor. She touched the collar of her uniform, making sure it concealed the fresh claiming mark resting against her neck. The dull sting along her right flank reminded her of the rogue fight, a secret badge of honor hidden beneath her clothes. Gideon pushed the heavy door open. He lowered the metal stairs. "After you, boss," Richard said. He stood right behind her, offering his steady presence. His inner wolf pranced in tight circles. "Bring her home, show her the territory, introduce the mate." Cynthia walked down the stairs. The air outside tasted like exhaust fumes and hot asphalt. It lacked the wild salt of the island, grounding her back in civilization. A sleek, charcoal gray SUV sat waiting on the tarmac. The vehicle featured blacked-out windows and brushed steel door handles. A pat guard in a dark suit opened the rear door. He bowed his head as Cynthia approached. She slid into the back seat. Richard followed, sitting close enough that their thighs brushed. Gideon took the front passenger seat, leaving the driving to the guard. The SUV accelerated, pulling out of the hangar and merging onto a thick concrete highway. Cynthia stared out the window. The cityscape rolled past in a blur of glass towers and dense traffic. She spent her entire career flying over cities just like this one, serving drinks to people who never looked her in the eye. Now, she sat next to the man who ruled the streets below. Richard rested his large hand over hers. His calloused fingers provided a silent anchor. "The main estate sits in the center of the financial district," Richard explained. His voice held the low, commanding tone of a leader preparing for an audience. "The elders use the top floor of our corporate tower for official pack business. They believe elevation projects power." Cynthia let out a short breath. "Pilots believe the same thing. I know how to handle big egos." The SUV slowed down 20 minutes later. They pulled into a secure underground parking garage. The guard stopped the vehicle near a set of private glass elevators. Cynthia grabbed her duffel bag. Richard stepped out and offered his hand. She took it, letting him guide her into the elevator car. Gideon pressed the button for the top floor. The numbers above the doors climbed rapid and smooth. "Harmon will strike first," Richard warned, keeping his eyes on the ascending numbers. "He demands tradition. He views anyone outside his circle as a threat to his influence." "Let him strike," Cynthia replied. Her spine turned to steel. Her inner wolf stood tall, shaking out its amber fur. "We face the pack. We do not yield. We show our teeth." The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. They stepped into a wide corridor lined with dark mahogany panels and frosted glass. At the far end of the hall, two heavy wooden doors stood open, revealing a sprawling boardroom. A long oak table dominated the space. 4 older men sat around the wood, reviewing stacks of paper. Richard kept his hand on the small of Cynthia's back. He guided her into the room. The conversation at the table died. 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward the doorway. Elder Harmon sat at the head of the oak table. He wore a stiff, 3-piece suit. Gray hair peppered his temples. His gaze locked onto Richard, then slid toward the woman standing at his side. Harmon's eyes narrowed, sweeping over Cynthia's navy blue skirt, her practical low heels, and the duffel bag slung over her shoulder. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the boardroom. Harmon placed his hands flat on the table. "Alpha, you missed a critical border negotiation. We expected you yesterday, and we certainly did not expect you to bring a human employee to a secure council meeting." Richard did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He projected pure, unyielding dominance. "I handled the border dispute through my beta," Richard stated. He stepped forward, bringing Cynthia with him. "And you will check your tone, Harmon. This is Cynthia. She is not human, and she is not an employee. She is your Lina." A collective gasp echoed in the room. Elder Miller, a younger man seated to the left, dropped his pen on the floorboards. Harmon stood up. His chair scraped loud against the wood. He stared at Cynthia, his face flushing dark red. "A Luna?" Harmon repeated, his voice dripping with venom. "She wears an airline uniform. She carries a cheap canvas bag. You bring a sky waitress into this sacred hall and expect us to bow?" Cynthia felt the sudden urge to laugh. She survived a hurricane. She fought a pack of starving rogues in the dirt. She let an alpha bite her neck. A man in a tight suit calling her a waitress barely registered on her threat radar. She dropped her duffel bag onto the carpet. It hit the ground with a solid thud. She smoothed her white blouse, took a step forward, and prepared to dismantle his ego. Chapter 22. The tension in the boardroom thickened. The air felt charged, ready to snap. Elder Harmon leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the oak table. He tried to project dominance, but Cynthia saw the rigid panic hiding in his posture. He feared losing control. "Bite his hand," her inner wolf snarled, pacing at the front of her mind. "Snap his fingers. Show him who rules." Cynthia ignored the feral demand. Violence offered a temporary solution. Sharp words inflicted permanent damage. She tapped into her years of customer service training. She knew how to de-escalate a threat while maintaining total control of the cabin. "I prefer the term flight attendant, Elder Harmon," Cynthia said. Her voice remained crisp, clear, and devoid of fear. "But I understand how details slip past people who spend their days hiding behind desks." Harmon's jaw tightened. "You speak out of turn, girl. Pack politics require pedigree. They require wealth and tactical training. You pour coffee for tourists." Richard stood motionless, his muscles coiled tight under his white dress shirt. His alpha instinct screamed at him to throw Harmon through the frosted glass window for disrespecting his mate. But he saw the fire in Cynthia's golden brown eyes. He knew she wanted this fight. He stepped back, giving her the floor. "I pour coffee," Cynthia agreed, nodding slowly. "I also evacuate burning aircraft in 90 seconds. I restrain violent passengers at 30,000 feet without backup. I manage panic, crisis, and survival while trapped in a metal tube over the ocean." Elder Miller shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between Cynthia and Harmon. The other 2 elders remained frozen, unsure how to handle a woman who refused to cower. "Your airline stories do not impress me," Harmon scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "This is the real world. Our pack faces rogue attacks and border wars. We need a Luna who understands combat, not safety manuals." Cynthia smiled. It was not a polite, friendly expression. It was the smile of a predator. The scent of wild jasmine and sweet citrus spiked in the room, carrying a heavy wave of raw power. "If you value combat experience, you should check your territory reports," Cynthia suggested. She unbuttoned the top button of her blouse, revealing the fresh, angry claiming mark on her collarbone. "Your Alpha and I spent yesterday morning on the reserve island. A boat of rogues tried to raid your supply shed." Harmon blinked, his arrogant facade cracking. "Rogues? On the reserve?" "4 of them," Cynthia confirmed, taking another step toward the oak table. "They flanked Richard on the beach. They went for his throat." "And what did you do?" Harmon sneered, trying to regain his footing. "Hide in the cabin and wait for clearance?" "I shifted," Cynthia said. Her voice dropped, vibrating with the wild truth of the memory. "I took down their leader. I broke their formation. I fought in the dirt to protect my mate, and we sent the survivors back to the sea." Silence hit the room again. It held a different texture this time. The shock morphed into profound respect. Richard watched her, his chest swelling with pride. "Our mate!" his wolf cheered, howling a victory song in his head. "She crushes the old men! She claims the territory!" "You sit in an air-conditioned tower and lecture me about pedigree," Cynthia continued, holding Harmon's gaze until the older man was forced to look away. "I hold my ground. I protect what belongs to me. I do not need a rich family name to recognize a threat, and I certainly do not need your permission to lead this pack." Elder Miller let out a low whistle. He stood up and bowed his head, showing his neck in a clear display of submission. The 2 silent elders followed his lead, rising from their chairs and offering deep bows to their new Lina. Harmon stood alone. He looked at his peers, realizing his support had vanished in the span of 3 minutes. He looked at Richard, hoping the Alpha would intervene and restore order. Richard offered 0 sympathy. "You heard her, Harmon." Harmon swallowed hard. The fight drained out of him. He stepped back from the oak table, lowered his eyes to the carpet, and bowed his head. "Welcome to the pack, Luna," Harmon mumbled, his voice tight with humiliation. "Thank you," Cynthia replied. She reached down and picked up her navy blue duffel bag. She turned to Richard, ignoring the 4 men. "The inspection is over. Show me the rest of the estate." Richard grinned. He placed his hand on the small of her back. They walked out of the boardroom, leaving the elders to process the hurricane that just ripped through their political games. The heavy wooden doors shut behind them, sealing Cynthia's victory. Chapter 23. Cynthia walked down the mahogany corridor. The adrenaline from the boardroom clash faded, leaving a sense of deep, settling peace. She proved her strength. She secured her place. "You broke his spirit in under 5 minutes," Richard noted. He guided her toward a private set of double doors at the end of the hall. "I usually require a formal vote to shut him up." "He relied on intimidation," Cynthia said, shifting the duffel bag on her shoulder. "Intimidation fails when the target refuses to play along." Richard opened the double doors. They stepped into the Alpha's private penthouse suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the sprawling cityscape below. Dark hardwood floors stretched across a massive living space. A sleek black leather sofa sat in the center of the room. No velvet, no gold trim. Cynthia let out a breath of relief. "Your home decorator possesses better taste than your aviation team." "I furnished this place myself," Richard admitted. He walked to the kitchen area, poured 2 glasses of water, and handed one to her. "I kept the designers out of my personal space." Cynthia took a sip. The cold water soothed her dry throat. She set her bag on the kitchen island and pulled the zipper open. She needed to unpack her meager belongings. She reached inside and pulled out the spare gray cabin blanket, setting it on a leather bar stool. Next, she pulled out her bright yellow rubber flip-flops. Richard stared at the cheap shoes. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "You brought the flip-flops," Richard said. "Are you planning a beach trip?" "I keep them as a reminder," Cynthia countered. She placed the yellow shoes neatly near the entryway. "They remind me to always check my luggage, and they remind me of a stubborn alpha who cannot cook a steak on high heat." Richard walked over, wrapping his arms around her waist. He pulled her against his white dress shirt. "You liked the steak." "It was acceptable," Cynthia murmured, resting her hands on his chest. Her inner wolf purred, content in the mate's territory. Safe den, good mate, no rogues here. Cynthia pulled back a fraction. She looked up into his dark eyes. The transition from the sky to the ground felt fast, but she needed to address a lingering issue before she settled completely. I require one final task before I officially unpack, Cynthia stated. Richard tilted his head. Name it. Cynthia reached into the pocket of her navy skirt and pulled out her cell phone. She unlocked the screen and held it up. We need to call Gideon. I have a redesign mandate for that aircraft. Richard smiled. He took the phone from her hand, dialed his beta, and put the call on speaker, resting the device on the kitchen counter. Gideon picked up on the second ring. Alpha, how did the meeting go? The Luna handled it, Richard answered. She has instructions for you. Cynthia leaned over the phone. Gideon, this is Cynthia. Yes, boss, Gideon replied, his voice full of amusement. I want a maintenance crew on the jet within the hour, Cynthia ordered, dropping right back into her professional aviation tone. Rip out the burgundy velvet seats, replace them with practical dark leather, something that cleans easy and holds up to turbulence. Understood, Gideon said, the sound of typing echoing in the background. Leather seats, what else? The bar cart, Cynthia said, her voice turning grim. Unbolt that gold-plated death trap from the floorboards, haul it out the cargo door, replace it with a secured, recessed cabinet built into the bulkhead. No loose edges. Richard watched her work. He loved the fierce dedication she poured into every detail. He spent his life giving orders, but listening to her restructure his jet felt like a profound gift. It proved she cared. It proved she planned to stay. She builds the den, his wolf yipped happily. She makes it safe. I will handle the cart myself, Gideon promised. Anything else, Luna? Check the emergency medical kits in the overhead bins, Cynthia added. Make sure the supplies meet federal standards. Do not cut corners. Consider it done, Gideon said. I will send you photos of the progress by tomorrow morning. Cynthia ended the call. She looked at Richard. The sky requires structure. You cannot fly in chaos. I gave you full authority, Richard said. He picked up her yellow flip-flops, moved them to a neat line by the door, and turned back to her. The pack is yours. The estate is yours. The jet is yours. And you? Cynthia asked, a playful challenge in her golden brown eyes. Richard closed the distance, trapping her against the kitchen counter. He leaned down, brushing his lips against the claiming mark on her neck. The touch sent a familiar, electric jolt straight down her spine. I belong to the Luna, Richard murmured. Cynthia grabbed his shirt collar, pulling him down for a deep, lingering kiss. The boardroom battles and the aviation rules faded away. She finally found a place where she belonged, and she planned to hold her ground forever. Chapter 24, 3 weeks later. The heat of the afternoon sun baked the smooth concrete of the private hangar. Cynthia stood near the boarding stairs, shielding her eyes from the glare. She did not wear her navy blue uniform today. She wore a tailored black blazer and dark jeans, trading the airline colors for her own practical style. The white jet gleamed on the tarmac. It looked identical on the outside, but Cynthia knew the real changes waited behind the heavy cabin door. Richard walked up beside her. He held 2 leather travel bags. He wore his usual dark suit pants, paired with a casual gray shirt. He looked relaxed. The tension that plagued him during their first meeting had vanished. Gideon sent the final clearance, Richard said, setting the bags near the stairs. We have a flight path to the Northern Territory for the treaty signing. Let's see if your beta followed my instructions, Cynthia replied. She walked up the metal stairs and stepped into the cabin. The blast of cold air conditioning greeted her. She paused in the entryway, inspecting the new layout. The hideous burgundy velvet was gone. Sleek, dark charcoal leather seats lined the cabin, bolted firmly to the floor tracks. The heavy tables featured rounded edges and secure latches. She turned her attention to the back corner. The gold-plated bar cart had vanished. In its place, a custom wooden cabinet sat recessed into the wall, featuring locking doors and 0 loose hazards. Cynthia ran her hand over the back of a leather seat. "Passes inspection." Richard walked in behind her, carrying the bags. He dropped them near the rear closet. "I told you Gideon works fast. He fears your write-ups more than my fangs." "Structure prevents disaster," Cynthia reminded him, taking a seat on the leather sofa. Gideon emerged from the cockpit. He wore his crisp pilot uniform, a wide grin stretching across his face. "Luna, the medical kits are stocked. The cabinets are locked. Are we cleared for departure?" "You are cleared, Captain," Cynthia said, offering him a genuine smile. Gideon nodded and returned to the cockpit. The heavy cabin door swung shut, the lock clicking into place. The jet engines roared to life. The familiar vibration hummed through the floorboards. Cynthia felt a rush of adrenaline. She loved the sky. She missed the unique thrill of leaving the ground behind. But this time, she was not pushing a beverage cart down an aisle filled with strangers. She sat on her own terms, traveling with her own pack. Richard sat down next to her on the sofa. He buckled his seatbelt. He reached over and grabbed her hand, lacing his thick fingers through hers. The jet rolled down the runway, picking up speed. The force pushed them back into the dark leather cushions. The wheels lifted off the concrete, sending the aircraft soaring into the bright blue sky. Cynthia looked out the window. The sprawling cityscape shrank into miniature blocks below them. "We fly!" her inner wolf barked, pressing its nose against the mental glass. "We hunt the clouds with our mate." Cynthia relaxed into the seat. She traced the knuckles of Richard's hand. "No turbulence today. It seems your pilot finally checked the weather reports." "He learned his lesson," Richard agreed. He turned his head, watching the sunlight catch the golden-brown depths of her eyes. "Are you happy, boss?" Cynthia thought about the long journey. She thought about the commercial flight where a grumpy alpha complained about legroom. She thought about the rusted door on the island cabin, the neon pink t-shirt, the rogue fight on the beach, and the silent elders in the boardroom. She fought for every inch of her new life. She looked at the man holding her hand. He offered her respect, power, and an unyielding partnership. He fixed what was broken and listened when she spoke. "I am exactly where I need to be," Cynthia answered. Richard leaned over and kissed her, a soft, deliberate promise sealed in the quiet cabin. His inner wolf let out a content sigh, finally at peace, knowing the den was secure and the mate was safe. The jet leveled off, cruising at 30,000 feet. Cynthia rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes as the steady hum of the engines carried them forward. The wild standoff was over. The journey ahead belonged solely to them. First class forever. The end. Quick favor, don't go anywhere yet. If you thought Cynthia was brave for laughing at an alpha's private jet and surviving a kidnapping, wait until you meet the heroine in this next story on your screen. You have to hear this disaster unfold. Click the video on your screen right now. It is a wild ride.